good with the middle. Kind of puts us in the same order.
So Jennifer texted me, Ray. that
Okay,
she'll
good
be here at
morning.
9:16.
What?
She has a 9:16.
Good morning. Last year we learned a new term in Park Short. Great morning. Great morning. Thank you. We're really thrilled that all of you are with us today. What a fantastic turnout. If you were here last year, we had about 160 people. We have 240 registered for today, which is really terrific. And on behalf of the GSAC Board of Directors, thank you all for being here today. I'm Dave Feit, and I'm the president of GSAC, which is the Gulf Shore Association of Condominiums, as I think most of you know. Members of our association include 77 condominium associations that go from Admiralty Point to Naples Cay. It's the home of 42 individual condominiums and roughly 7,000 residents. Virtually all of GSAC members are situated on the Gulf of Mexico or Venetian Bay, and all are affected in some way by significant storm events and sea level rise. A key element of GSAC's mission is education, and there's nothing more important than what we're here today to discuss: preparing for climate change and sea level rise. This is our second forum on the environment. Many of you were here with us last year for a very successful water quality forum. As with last year, this year's forum was spearheaded and developed by City Council member Ray Christman. He pulled together a terrific group of subject matter experts who will be presenting today. Ray was elected to City Council in 1999 and was re-elected to a full term in February 2022. In addition to being a member of City Council, he serves as the chair of the city's CRA and is a member of the County Coastal Advisory Committee. Ray has a passion for building a better Naples and protecting the environment, in particular issues affecting water quality. Please welcome Ray Christman, the moderator of today's forum.
Well, good morning. Let me add my greetings to those of David's and thank David and the GSAC leadership for putting this forum on. And as many in the audience know, they've shared the wealth, so to speak, and extended invitations to members of other homeowners associations from Moorings and Old Naples and Seagate and other parts of the city. So we have an audience that's broad and diverse here today, I think. I work closely with GSAC as I do with all the HOAs in town, and they do a great job, and for their members and really for the city as a whole, and it's always a pleasure. I will correct one thing that David said in his introduction, and I know it was just a misstep on his part. He said I was first elected to council in 1999. It was actually 2019. In 1999, I was still in high school. And I just wanted to correct that for the record. I have a few opening slides to go through that will frame and put into context, I hope, what we're going to hear about today from our panelists. And
The slide's not advancing.
yeah. What do I need to do?
You want some coaching? When you were in high school, they didn't have technology.
No, they didn't.
Let's see.
It's this one?
The down arrow will work. Maybe it'll work.
It's the right arrow.
Where's our AV guy?
Let me see Yeah, I don't know if there's a tech person. The computer's not advancing, and
Oh, there it goes.
oh,
There we go.
All right.
What did you hit?
I think that's forward,
Yeah.
and that's reverse, and that should be forward and reverse. Okay. Is it functioning? Try. Do you happen to know where the indicator is for the slide advance in the room? It might be maybe aim it towards the back of the room, right?
There we go. That's it.
So
Okay. We got it now. So to put this program in some context for you all today, our natural environment is obviously a key influence on Naples and Collier County. It impacts our quality of life, our economy, the patterns of development that we see in our community. It's the reason why people first came to Naples and Collier County, and it's the reason why they continue to want to live here and visit. And within the broader natural environment, water is, in my view anyway, the key element for sustaining that natural environment. Water supply, water quality, stormwater management, wastewater treatment, these are all water-related issues that are central to managing our natural environment and the question of resiliency. Now, I don't have to tell all of you that the threats and challenges to maintaining and sustaining our quality natural environment and water quality are only increasing. We have more frequent and intensive storm events, rising sea levels, warming ocean temperatures, as you'll hear from our panelists, growing population, growing development pressures, and all the markers that we think about are out there telling us that something is happening to us. More frequent flooding events, red tide events, harmful algae blooms, shrinking fisheries, disappearing seagrass, deteriorating water quality in all of our water bodies, the Morings Bay, Naples Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, Gordon River. All of these things are telling us that we have challenges and threats at an increasing level. So what we all have to do in government at all levels, but also nonprofits, businesses, private residents, is begin to think about how to plan for a different future, and that's what resiliency planning is. How can we respond to our changing environment, maintain and restore as appropriate as quality, and be able to live and work in places like Southwest Florida over the long term? So what is resiliency planning? This is Ray Christman's definition. It's quite simple. It's about adapting to changing environmental conditions. And that is a necessary but reactive approach by definition. How we accomplish that, but also remain focused on environmental protection, meaning how do we address the root causes of the problems and threats that are causing the need for us to engage in resiliency planning in the first place, is also, I think, part of the discussion that we want to have, and I encourage the panelists and all of you to think about that in terms of what these root causes are that are addressing these issues, and we can talk about that today when we get to the question and answer session. So there are efforts underway to deal with this question of resiliency. The increased hurricane activity that we've seen over the last period of years in Florida has spurred action at the state level. There is now a well-funded resiliency grant program, and that provides money for planning and implementation that comes from the state level. The City of Naples has engaged in a climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning effort funded in part with state money. I think Hurricane Ian was a catalyst for new urgency about all of these issues in Southwest Florida and other parts of the state in general. And we also have this U.S. Army Corps of Engineers coastal storm risk management study that's underway and is going to come to fruition sometime this summer or early fall, which is really dealing in its own way with resiliency planning efforts and how we in Naples and Collier County decide to engage with that study, with those study results and integrate it into our own planning efforts is another major issue that we're going to be needing to deal with here locally over the next year. So the questions for all of us to think about include the following. What can we do to make a difference? And what's the cost of that and who pays? Is it fight or is it flight long term? Can we protect the coastline and continue to live near it and enjoy it the way we have, or do we ultimately have to abandon it, at least from a residential and business standpoint? And if we choose to protect, then how? What are the ways? Natural infrastructure, physical infrastructure, tougher land use regulations, elevation. What are the ways in which we can adapt to this changing environment? So today, to help us talk about these issues and give you some perspectives on it and hopefully further your own thinking, we have three high-quality people who spend their days thinking about these issues. First, we have Mike Savarese, who is the Florida Gulf Coast University Distinguished Professor and co-creator of the Acune model, a new tool for resilience planning. Many of you probably have heard about the Acune model or even seen demonstrations of it, and Mike will be talking about that. We have Natalie Hardman, who is the Natural Resources Manager for the City of Naples, and she's the project leader for our city's current resilience and adaptation planning study, which I mentioned a moment ago. And we have Jennifer Hirado, who is the Chief Resiliency Officer for Broward County and also the Deputy Director of the Resilient Environment Department within Broward County, and has had a very active role, not just in Broward, but in regional Southeast Florida planning efforts involving multiple counties and communities interested in resilient planning on the other side of the state. Jennifer is the person who had the longest journey to be with us here today. I think I saw her just come in and get here, which is good news. And Jennifer, you can just come up on the stage at your convenience, and we're pleased to have you make the journey and join us here as well. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn the program over to first Mike Savarese. Each of our three panelists will simply come to the microphone in sequence and make their presentations. And at the end, I will return. I'll have a few questions to ask them, and then we will turn it over to you for questions for the audience. So be thinking about that. Thanks very much again for being here. And Mike, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I just want you to know that we tested Jennifer Hirado's resilience capabilities because we sent her to the wrong church, and she managed to find us okay. So she's clearly someone to pay attention to. Anyway, yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm so glad there's interest among your homeowners associations. I think you are the people that have to deal with these kinds of problems, problems that you need to be foresightful about. What I want to talk to you about as my portion of the panel as the scientist on this crew is to talk to you a little bit about what kinds of tools we have at our disposal here in Collier County, here in Naples, from which we can do a better job of building our coastal resilience capacity. So it's about tool development and tool use. I'd like to do three things in the few minutes I have available to you. A big part of planning for the future is determining or trying to predict or anticipate how high sea level is likely to go as we move forward in the future, because the ultimate driver of climate change that's going to affect us in our coastal posture is sea level and how rapidly it rises over the next few decades and century. So I'd like to talk a little bit first about what we call sea level curves. What might sea level do, and what's a logical choice for our planning in terms of sea level curves? The second part, Ray introduced this Acune model. He introduced me as a co-developer. The truth is I'm not a computer modeler. I am sort of the liaison for the group of modelers. So I've been serving as sort of the person on the ground here that's hopefully putting this tool in the hands of users. So I want to talk a little bit about this first tool, the Acune, now what's known as the Acune Plus tool. And the second great instructor, if you will, of how to deal with resilience is our history. And there's no greater teacher, frankly, than Hurricane Ian. Ian provided us with great insights about our relative vulnerabilities and our relative resiliencies. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about the work we've been doing at FGCU through the Water School as to how we can learn from what we can learn from Hurricane Ian. How do we make lemonade out of lemons, so to speak? All right, first of all, sea level curves. How do we anticipate the rate of sea level rise as we move forward into the future? Well, we use computer models, very, very sophisticated computer models. And then we compare those computer models against what scientists call empirical data, measurements that we actually make. So you make some observations, you compare those observations against the models, and if the two match reasonably well, then maybe you've got a reasonably good model with which to plan from. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has been the principal federal agency that has been developing sea level curves for community use. In 2022, they published their most recent set of sea level curves, and it's those sea level curves that we have available to us and can be potential choices for how we plan here in Southwest Florida. Now, I mentioned empirical data. I'll try not to overwhelm you with too many of these kinds of slides with data and graphs and lines and squiggles, because they tend to cloud the brain. But this is what's known as a tide gauge station. There used to be a tide gauge station on Naples Pier until it was taken out, ironically, by Hurricane Ian. And what you're seeing here are the heights of the tides since the 1960s or so, all the way up to the future. And you see a lot of variability in those jigs and jags, but that straight line represents the average sea level rise rate that has existed since 1960 to the present day. And that line has a modest slope. It's about 3 millimeters per year. I like to tell people 3 millimeters per year is about the thickness of 2 slices of Kraft American cheese. So if you put double cheese on your burgers, you get a sense as to how thick or thin 3 millimeters happen to be. Now, if you take a portion of this curve, the last 20 years or so, you can see that isolated here, and that more recent version of the curve shows a much steeper slope. Okay? That has a slope of about 8 millimeters per year, which is double the rate we've experienced previously. And the truth is, we're seeing a doubling of sea level rise rate since the mid-20th century all the way up into the present. So we're dealing with significant accelerations of sea level rise, and that rate of acceleration can help us make a better choice about what sea level curve we might use. This next slide is a little more complicated. You actually see 3 maps, and you can see it's hard for me to point out what you're looking at since the screen is kind of in front of me. But if you look at the middle panel, the one that has lots of reds, if you look around the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, particularly in our part of Southwest Florida, you can see that we're color-coded a deep red. That deep red represents, again, empirically measured, actual observations made of sea level rise rates that are about 8 millimeters per year. And this is something we're seeing Gulf-wide. It's not just the Naples phenomenon. It's happening across the entire Gulf of Mexico. So again, it's a significant acceleration and something we need to consider as we do our planning. This graph, if you look at the top, strange, not the slide I had entered, and I'm not sure why it's oriented like that. I think I'm just going to skip this, given the fact that it looks distorted, and move right to this. Here you can see on the lower right are a series of NOAA's 2022 curves. And you can see they stretch out to about the year 2100, all the way to the right side of the graph. And our trajectory, how high sea level goes, depends upon a lot of things. It depends in part what we do as a global society to manage our carbon footprint. It also is influenced by how quickly or not so quickly the major ice sheets break up, particularly the glaciers in Antarctica and Greenland. If those ice sheets break up more quickly and more readily, if we do little to nothing about our carbon footprint, then we're more likely to follow the trajectory on the higher curves. If we do more to manage, we would be lower down. If you look at the empirical data I just showed you, and you look at the NOAA curves, you can see here on the red box that's on the graph, we are currently following the trajectory somewhere between what's known as the NOAA intermediate high curve and the NOAA high curve itself. So we are currently on a trajectory for a higher sea level rise rate than those trajectories you can see a little bit lower. We'd be much better off if we were planning for the NOAA intermediate curve or the NOAA low curve, but it doesn't appear as if we're moving in those directions. So the first recommendation that we would make as a scientific community is that you plan conservatively and plan for that intermediate high curve, if not the high curve itself, and recognize that we're going to be dealing with significant increases in sea level as we move forward into the future. Now, what is the Accoon model and why is there this little plus next to it? The Accoon model has matured and developed over the last, it's probably almost 10 years now. But currently, Collier County and the city of Naples, all the cities within Collier County, now have the most robust and sophisticated computer modeling tool that we call Accoon Plus. What it does is it can anticipate future flooding by two causes. Flooding caused, well, actually by three causes, I should say. Flooding caused by sea level rise, flooding caused by precipitation, excessive rainfall, and most importantly to us, considering we just experienced Ian, is flooding caused by storm surge, okay? Accoon can look at what we call nuisance flooding. In other words, we can look at how high tides as we move forward in the future are likely to flood city streets. So even without a storm, without any precipitation, we will experience greater frequency of what we call sunny day flooding because the high tides are getting higher because the sea level is rising. You can use Accoon in that mode. And then you can also use Accoon in what's called a compound flooding mode. And that's where we're able to combine and predict the impact of storm surge along with freshwater precipitation flooding the landscape. In addition, the county and the city has made great efforts to plot all their assets. This church is an asset for the city of Naples, and it sits on the map, and you can compare how that asset is likely to behave or how vulnerable that asset is going to be in the future under a variety of conditions given sea level rise rates and the impact of storms. I don't really have the luxury to show you a live demonstration of the model, but it does exist, and we do, decision makers and planners have access to that model. I'm just going to show you some stills just to give you a sense as to how this works, okay? So Accoon is a geo tool. It's a visualization tool and allows you to generate maps at different points into the future. This is kind of a holistic view of the city of Naples. You can see Naples Bay and the Gordon River and the Tamiami Trail running through the middle here. And this represents 2070, okay? So less than 50 years into the future. And this is assuming the intermediate high sea level curve is followed as we move forward into the future. If we follow the intermediate high curve, sea level in 2070 will be 40 inches higher than it is today, which is a little over 3 feet, which is a significant rise in sea level. What you can see mapped here, just based on high tides, are the city streets and the neighborhoods and the areas that are likely to be flooded by nuisance flooding at extreme high tides, maybe as much as 20, 24 times a year, if not more. And the depth of the water is color-coded. So the blues, the cooler colors, are shallower water depths, and the hotter colors here, the hottest color is green and represent a little deeper depth. So we're talking about anywhere between 1 to 6 feet of standing water on the landscape. Now, this is Naples in its entirety. I thought you might be interested in seeing the neighborhoods that represent your condominium association. And here you can see essentially your neighborhoods are on this map. Again, this represents 2070, the intermediate high curve. And you can see the strip between, I guess it's Venetian Bay to the east of us and the Gulf of Mexico to the right of us. The entire strip there between the two waterways is flooded with great frequency as we move forward under the 2070 condition. You can also see the interior, the Gordon River, Naples Bay. That high tide is going to inch its way or creep its way northward and also flood Naples kind of from the inside out as water moves up the Gordon River and out of Naples Bay. Now that's just nuisance flooding, okay? What if a major storm hits? This represents 2040. Okay, again with the intermediate high curve. And this is the 1 in 100 year storm. What is a 1 in 100 year storm? Hard to say. I mean, Ian was probably worse than a 1 in 100 year storm. But here, the compound flooding, the effect of sea level rise, the effect of storm surge, and the effect of freshwater precipitation, you can see significantly floods to much greater depths a larger portion of the footprint that is your part of Naples. If I move to a more serious condition, 2070, as we move forward into the future, so this is 2070, a number of decades out, again, intermediate high, the 1 in 100 year storm. You can see the entire region is essentially inundated with as much as 12 to 14 feet of water on the landscape. Okay, not very different than what was experienced at least further north, and particularly in Sanibel and Fort Myers during the passage of Hurricane Ian. Okay, so this Accoon tool is here. It's already being used. I know Natalie will be talking a little bit about how the city of Naples is using the tool. Everglades City has used the tool. Collier County has it available to it. Marco Island has it available to it. And your association has the tool available as well. The second part then is learning from history, where the event in history is Hurricane Ian. At FGCU, we've been working quite closely with a variety of local governments and neighborhoods. You can see them outlined here in yellow and red. And we've been doing some significant work kind of mapping and describing the impact of Hurricane Ian along the coast. And what we're doing is we're using remote sensing technology. We're flying drones with special sensors that allow us to get detailed maps of the elevation, basically creating topographic maps. We're also using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar tools to look below the surface. And in essence, we're able to create high-resolution maps before the storm, what it looked like before Ian, and again, immediately after Ian. And then after, again, coastal management groups have made some improvements. For example, the city of Naples has implemented or in place a new berm along the beaches, and we're able to map that as well and monitor its resilience as we move into the future. I don't have to talk to you about Ian. You've all experienced it. Its biography is well imprinted in your brains. Suffice it to say, it was the perfect storm for creating surge. We haven't experienced surge like this in our part of Southwest Florida since Hurricane Donna in 1960. And the reason for that is the storm had really high winds, the winds were always blowing on shore, and the storm was moving very, very slowly in a forward progression. And that's what caused the pileup of water. Now, Naples got hit hard, Collier County got hit hard, but our neighbors and friends to the north, Lee County, was damaged much more seriously. I'd like to give you a sense of some of the lessons that we've learned already from Hurricane Ian's damage. A lot of these lessons come not from Naples' experiences, but from Fort Myers Beach's experiences and Sanibel's experiences. Here's the first obvious lesson. This is Fort Myers Beach. You can see stretching from left to right, has an interesting shape. The thing that's clear to us and not necessarily clear to emergency managers is that you can't expect the same conditions everywhere just because your jurisdiction, the city of Naples, stretches for a certain geographic length along the coast. Different regions are going to experience different effects. Here's Fort Myers Beach. Those 5 boxes experience very different conditions, even though Fort Myers Beach is one jurisdiction, it's one town that's being managed as an entity. So management needs to recognize that there's variability depending upon where you are in vulnerability. Variability in vulnerability. That's a tongue twister. One of the things we learned was, ironically, it wasn't the surge coming in, but rather the surge going out that caused the greatest damage. Geologists call that ebb surge, the returning ebb tide. And that ebb surge created intense erosion, particularly on Lover's Key, Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel. You can see photographs of those surge channels on the left, and that wonderfully, seemingly pretty color-coded map on the upper right represents what we call a digital elevation model. The colors represent elevation along this portion of Sanibel Island. The hot colors, the reds, represent high. The cool colors represent the lows. And you can see those surge channels that were ripped through the dune ridges and back towards the Gulf. The photograph below shows you those 5 ridges. as they were photographed after the storm. So our second message is we're used to managing for wind. We don't really manage that well for surge. We need to be managing for two types of surge coming in and surge going out. Sanibel learned a very interesting and unintended lesson about ebb surge. Here you can see our 5 dune pathways that were permitted and allow people to walk across the dune fields without doing much damage. Every one of those passages, those pathways, became the location of storm surge. So the way we manage our dunes and the way we manage our crossovers influences the way they're going to behave. This is something that never occurred to anybody before Ian. I think to save time, I think I'm just going to skip ahead and talk a little bit about the last lesson, and that is to value our dunes and to manage those dunes and vegetate those dunes in the best way we know how. I'm going to show you a time series of these maps. This is for the city of Naples. What you're looking at here is the elevations just north of the pier in 2018, obviously before Ian. And then I'm going to show you what it looked like after Ian. And then I'm going to show you what it looked like after the city of Naples put in their berm. And then I'm going to show you what this looked like after Hurricane Idalia last fall passed through and influenced that berm. So it's a way of learning how our management strategies of renourishing or building dunes and berms on the beach can be affected, or how they can be less vulnerable. So here you can see is the pre-Ian condition in 2018. The reds represent the highs, again the greens the lows. There's a really nice high spot in the back of the beach. It's the way the beach had been managed in previous history. As I switch to the next one, you can see all of that red has disappeared. The beach is considerably lower. All of that sand that's disappeared was thrown into the city streets. If you were here just after Ian, you know there was a great effort to actually collect the sand that was deposited within the city and get it back and employ it to renourish the beach. Okay, so this is what it looked like immediately after the storm in November of 2022. Here's what it looks like after the berm was in place. Okay, so the berm, you can see that yellow stretch. I'm not sure how to point it out to you effectively. You can see the deep red. Just to the left of that is a narrow yellowish orange stretch. That represents the berm. Okay, those two little dots you can see on that orange strip that's down at the bottom represent the width of the berm. And now that berm was in place without any vegetation put on it. The city didn't have money to buy vegetation. Vegetation was ready, but FEMA money was available to build the berm. So the berm went in without the protective vegetation, and lo and behold, Hurricane Idalia passed by us in the fall of 2023, and we lost about 2/3 of the berms, 1/3 of the berm's sand. So here you can see it before Idalia, and here it is after Idalia. You can see the width of that yellowish orange strip has narrowed. Okay, so we need to be conscious of our dunes, and we need to vegetate them in the best way we know how. And again, that information is there to help the city and the county. So that's it for my part. I have no idea how long I talked for. I suspect it was too long, and I apologize. And I'm going to pass this on to Natalie, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the city of Naples' efforts in dealing with these problems. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Natalie Hardman. I'm the Natural Resources Manager with the City of Naples, and I'm here to talk to you about our adaptation plan. We're in the process of developing it. So I'm going to talk to you about the process that we're going through and some of the decision processes that we are trying to make with the help of this community, staff members, and stuff. So I want to start by just reminding everyone kind of what the goals were for our project. It was to increase the resilience of Naples to the immediate and long-term threats of climate change hazards, to protect and enhance public assets, natural resources, and quality of life for all. And our objectives for this plan are to identify key susceptibilities in public assets to climate hazards, to identify actionable strategies supported by city leadership and the community, and to engage with regional stakeholders and maximize strategy benefits and funding. So that was our objectives and our goals, and we're trying to keep those in mind as we proceed through the process. So the project timeline, currently where the kind of aqua or green line is on the arrow. We completed our vulnerability assessment in 2023. That is available on our website. Go to Natural Resources and under Resiliency and Sustainability on the left side, click on it and you'll be able to see the vulnerability assessment in the middle bottom. We hope to have our adaptation plan finalized this spring, hopefully really soon. We plan on having presenting it to council very soon. So, as part of our adaptation planning process, that's a 3-phase process. The first phase was to assess our vulnerability, which was completed. Phase 2 is our adaptation planning, which we're currently in the middle of. And phase 3 will be strategy implementation. And, we'll go and look for funding and ways to construct our projects. So, our adaptation plan is based on flooding hazards and extreme heat hazards. So we're taking into consideration high tides plus sea level rise, rainfall plus sea level rise, and coastal storms plus sea level rise for our flooding hazards. And then for our extreme heat, we're looking at how our area is supposed to increase in heat over the rest of the century. So we'll start with our flooding concerns, and I borrowed a slide from Dr. Savary's presentation, which shows the Naples tide gauge, historically, and then with the superimposition of the 2000 to 2021 rate of increase. So it kind of gives us an idea of what we're dealing with and how quickly we're getting there. Looking at our flooding potential, this is our current conditions. This was developed in our in our vulnerability assessment and was done through the Accoon modeling system. So we did use Accoon during all of our vulnerability assessment, and all of our baseline material is based on that program. So you can see right now, this is our current conditions, what we have on a typical day, and then a 100-year storm event. This is what's expected in 2040 with about 5 inches of sea level rise and a 100-year storm event. And then when we get to like 2070, we should have approximately a foot of sea level rise and conditions and the 100-year storm event. So that is what we have to keep in mind as we go forward, as we develop our adaptation plan and kind of develop projects that can help us be resilient in the face of some of these scenarios. So the next thing is our heat concerns. We want to look at heat and how that's going to affect us going forward. So currently, well, I should say back in our baseline, which was the 70s to 2005, we have a mean daily temperature of approximately 81 to 83 degrees. In mid-century, we expect that to change to approximately 85 to 87 degree mean temperature, and by the end of the century, we expect that to be approximately 91 to 93 degree mean daily temperature. And it's like, okay, we get those in the summertime, right? But we expect the increase in days at these temperatures. So back in the 70s to 2000, we had 0 to 20 days, at these types of temperatures. During the mid-century, we expect to have approximately 60 to 80 days at these temperatures. And by the end of the century, we expect there to be 120 to 140 days. So you keep in mind that as temperature goes up, the length of time we hit those temperatures also increases. And 2023 was the hottest year on record. And, like we hear that every year, right? 2018 is the hottest year on record. 2019 is the hottest year on record. Well, 2023 was the hottest year on record. And I don't know if you're here during the summer times, but I know last summer when I was here, every day at like somewhere between 6 and 7 o'clock, my phone is blowing up, heat advisory, heat advisory, heat advisory. And those heat advisories are issued when we have high temperatures and also a high heat index. So it feels like temperatures are above 100 degrees. So in Naples last year, we had 53 days of at least 2 hours of heat index value of 105 or higher. So just, something to keep in mind as we go forward. We have to consider how this affects the city, how this affects workers within the city, and, so there's a question. Should I take it?
We're going to hold questions, if you don't mind.
The fact that rainfall last year was less than 30% of what it is in a normal year, and how does that factor in?
Could we hold that
What do you attribute that to?
Excuse me, sir, could we hold questions till the end? We'll come back to you, I promise.
This was right at the moment I was
Yeah.
listening to that.
Yeah.
And that's an appropriate question at this point in time, because that's a significant event. Why was rainfall less than 30% of what it normally is, and have you taken that into consideration? What do you attribute it to?
We're in the process of going through the adaptation plan, so, most scenarios will be considered. Outlier years are outlier years. The lower rainfall was attributed to an El Nino event, so that we have those occasionally as years go by. El Nino events happen regularly through history, and was what our less rainfall was attributed to. Hot, drier summers, wetter winters. So we have had a pretty wet winter this year. So yeah, I'd like to continue on with our adaptation strategy and how we develop we're in the process of doing this, and I wanted to kind of give an outline of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So the city has different types of assets. So, as a city, we have to look at our transportation assets, and those assets include streets, traffic cabinets, city dock, the airport. We have critical infrastructures. Those critical infrastructures include water, wastewater, stormwater, and electrical utilities. So we have critical community and emergency facilities like police, fire stations, our city government offices. We have schools, universities, and our hospitals. And then we have our natural areas and cultural areas, our parks, beaches, dunes, and our historic district that we have to be protective of, and we have to consider all of these assets as we go forward. So we have different types of approaches to adaptation. We have physical approaches where we go out and construct something to make us more resilient, or we have non-physical where we maybe change our codes, or maybe state laws get changed that allow people to affect their own change, build higher, or other types of changes that would allow people to make themselves more resilient. So as we go through and look at our assets, we have to look at, say, the sensitivity of our assets to flooding and to heat. So our electrical and mechanical equipment, how is that affected by heat and flooding? Is the material that it's made of corrosive? Is it malleable in heat? Is it susceptible to increased duration or frequency? So it's okay if it happens one time, but if it happens 5 times, maybe it doesn't handle that as well. Or 10 times and it's toast. We just have to keep that in mind as to how much it can handle. And then while we're looking at all this above ground, we also have to look at the buried components of our system and make sure that there isn't something happening that we didn't think about. We have to kind of be cognizant of those and what's going on. And then what are the consequences if some of those systems were to fail? Is there a life safety consequence? Is there a level of service disruption to our communities? Is there a public health effect associated with those infrastructure issues? Is there a reduction in water quality or loss of jobs? Is there damage to the habitat, or is there impacts to our cultural assets? You know, we have to be kind of aware of that and take that into consideration. So as we work through it, we look at the consequences compared to the sensitivity of the structure, and we kind of helps us form a prioritization for the projects. And the higher the consequence and the higher the sensitivity, the higher the project is prioritized. So once we get that kind of priority list, which we're there now, we have a list of projects that are somewhat prioritized. Then we take that list and we go through and look at that list and look at the projects and say, we look at the engineering for the project. Does it protect the city's critical assets? Does it provide the ability to adapt to climate considerations over time? Does it address multiple hazards? You know, we want to know these things because it will help us inform our project list and help us to maybe develop a more phased approach in some, in some areas. So when we look at the environment, does it improve the water quality? Does it protect, enhance, and expand sensitive habitats and ecosystem services? Does it reduce or offset energy consumption? Then we proceed to look at social benefits. Does it improve the public health metrics? Does it enhance resilience of the transportation network? Does it reduce risk of injury or loss of life? And finally, we take the projects and look at feasibility. Is there funding and financing available to do the project? You know, can we go out and build it? Do we have the money right now, or is it something we readily can get money to construct? What are the capital costs versus the maintenance costs? Is it like a very high capital cost and, you know, maybe just typical maintenance, or is it something that doesn't cost much up front but has high maintenance costs going forward? The ability to implement given current policies and regulations. So, you know, we may have to prioritize some projects because we can go ahead and go forward with them, and other projects we may have to change policy or work on changing regulations in order to affect those changes. So that's where we are now. So we're going through all of these projects and looking at, you know, every project is being compared to this list, and how do we go about, what does this project entail? Some projects spur other projects. It's like, oh, well, if we did that, we really need to do this. So this is where we are right now. As we speak, I'm in the middle of meetings with all directors and, you know, staff, trying to make sure we understand what each project entails. So we initially developed 73 projects. Of those projects, 56 concerned flooding and 17 addressed extreme heat. 60% of the projects were physical, and 40% were, other way around. 60% were non-physical, so it was policy changes, code changes, and 40% were physical construction, so we're going to go out and build something. And so this is what we were dealing with, this is where we were. We are going to take that information, those evaluation criteria that I went through, the community preferences, we had workshops and surveys, and, you know, I really hope that everyone was able to provide input into those mechanisms. And, you know, then we have the city working group. There's people from each, staff member from each of the sections in the city, and, you know, go through and put this together. So we plan on presenting this. It's tentatively scheduled for May 15th to City Council, and, you know, tune in and see what we've come up with. So I am ready for Jennifer to take over the presentation.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Fortunately, Naples doesn't have as much traffic as Broward County, so I was able to zip over here quite quickly and really appreciate being included today. Already a lot of great information shared, And, it's always kind of challenging to think about specifically what to share, given I don't know everyone's background, and I've learned a lot about what's happening in Naples currently. But what I'll be talking about for Broward County on the East Coast is some of how we've been working to address the climate challenge regionally, and then bringing what we know from the regional level into our planning efforts within Broward County. I think, I don't need to provide a whole lot in the way of background. You're all ultimately quite familiar with some of the recent challenges, which include, the compound flooding that was already well gone over, increasing everyone's flood exposure, the severity, duration, expanse. Heat's been well covered. We think about damages, losses, personal property, impacts to services. And while those are all real disruptions, we have this overall concern as well about the economic consequences. How much can we pay for? What happens with the top tax base? What happens with the overall economy, long-term investment strategies? What's happening with the housing markets? There's all these, implications that are quite real in terms of just the acuteness of a personal impact in trying to get through events. And then the overall quality of life considerations that we're working to contend with. And if anyone's been impacted, how challenging it is, how emotionally, there's all kinds of elements that go into that. And so as we look at these exposures, we know it's quite complex. The only thing that I didn't hear raised that I don't know if you all have to work with in the same way that we do on the East Coast is groundwater table rise. So in addition to the water coming in from the coast and the increased rainfall, we, I think, have water coming from the inland areas. Other areas are draining and the water's coming at you from the inland areas and then coming up from the ground. That affects a lot of the drainage and flood management infrastructure in our communities. I suspect the same is true here. There are strategies that have worked in the past or worked adequately that simply aren't going to be available in the future depending on what happens with groundwater table rise. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But ultimately, we're dealing with a very complex system, far more complex than many other parts of the United States need to contend with. I'm really glad to have seen the sea level rise projections that are being used in the planning processes. I will acknowledge that we on the East Coast have used the NOAA Intermediate High for 15 years of planning as a region. So in our community, we've been partnering with Miami-Dade County, Palm Beach County to the north, and Monroe County down in the Keys on climate mitigation and adaptation efforts since 2009. We have a regional climate action plan. We do a lot of planning together, and we work together on a weekly basis. And it's really critical because, transportation systems are connected. What we choose to do on our beach can affect a neighboring community's beach. Our water resources are connected. Some of the projects we need to pay for, we can't afford on our own. Larger scale creates an economy of scale that allows us to move forward with regional solutions as opposed to, tiny little ones that may or may not work as well together. So our reefs are connected. So there's a lot of dependencies that we have and shared interests. We live in one community, work in another. But one of the most significant deliverables that has come through our efforts was the very early development of a regional sea level rise projection. And we've updated this and adopted it across the 4 counties now. As I said, over a period of 15 years, every contractor in the region, every capital project in the region, all of the academic partners, anybody who's doing business with the counties or within the cities are ultimately held to this regional sea level rise projection. And I'm going to talk about how it's moved into the projects, because it's one thing to say, well, we plan for sea level rise, and another is, well, how does that ultimately affect the infrastructure and how do we build that in? I would agree that, and I'm stating again, the NOAA Intermediate High, the acceleration of sea level rise, we're planning, currently it's about 1 inch every 4.25 years, and we are planning for the 40 inches by 2070 relative to 2010, so, but that's been a little bit of an iteration. So how are we moving through the planning process? How do we translate that to our work in the county? One, I want to say that it's been embedded in our land use plan. So the map that you see here is a very simple map. It isn't as complex as the hydrologic models that we use for a lot of other detail, but this was the first cut to say, based only on land elevation and sea level rise, which areas of the county are at greatest risk. And this doesn't, again, it doesn't take into account a lot of canals and so forth, but it's just based upon elevation and sea level rise. So if we have a project that comes in for review in terms of a land use change, and this is typically, you know, an increase in density, and we have challenges to legislation at times that try to limit how we can use these tools, but we ensure that sea level rise and resilience is part of that planning process. So that's just an important first cut. But we've also been able to amend drainage requirements. So this is surface water management and drainage infrastructure, and you might think of retention areas. There's things like French drains, there's deep wells, but this is the most fundamental element in development. If you don't get the drainage infrastructure right, you can't be guessing about flood elevations and the like. This is the most fundamental aspect of planning. And for us, as I said, with the groundwater table rise, it was the most principal thing that we needed to address. We've addressed what we call the tidal flood barriers, which are seawall heights and berms, dunes. We have modified our 100-year flood elevations. So this is the finished floor elevation, the lowest horizontal member of a structure, so that threshold when you walk up into a building, we've modified that to account for future conditions. And we've also amended design storms. So when we talk about a 1 in a 100-year rainfall event that historically would have delivered 15 inches of rain, and we know now that it's a 20% increase in rainfall intensity, and I'm not going to do, 18 inches now. That's the new number. So even though at the state level there might be a different criteria, we've adjusted our rainfall intensifications to account for what we know to be happening. So what does this look like? With respect to the groundwater table rise, that graph on the top middle might look like a sea level rise projection, but it's actually the change in our groundwater table. And in the eastern part of our county, it's very much responsive 1-to-1. 1 foot of sea level rise, 1 foot change in the groundwater table. And we've measured this much change, more than 1.5 feet over just several decades, through a combination of sea level rise and more active pumping. The modeling on the left shows that degree of sensitivity to the groundwater table rise, with the red is 1-to-1, the yellow line is about 50% to 1. The table in the middle shows the modeled change in the groundwater table from where it's been historically to modeled for just over 2 feet of rise. That's the blue line. The red line shows land elevation, and where those things intersect, it means you're going to have a much more difficulty dealing with drainage because your water table is up at the surface. And so now we need to account for that change and ensure that when we develop that drainage infrastructure will function across the duration of the lifespan of that structure. So we've amended our map since 2017. Everyone has to plan for the 2 feet of sea level rise. We're now in the process of updating that map to the 3.3 foot sea level rise. So it just went through our planning council process, and it will be going to our board of commissioners within the next month. So we're constantly iterating depending on what we're needing to do with respect to the sea level rise projections. On seawall height, we partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers. We conducted hydrodynamic modeling of the coastal water elevations, and we modeled 2 feet of sea level rise plus extreme tide, king tide, plus high frequency storm surge. So that's a storm surge with about a 25-year return interval. Based on that, we adjusted, it's not really adjustment. Previously, there was no minimum height for seawalls. We have 31 municipalities in our county, about 12 are coastal, and the seawalls were all over the place. And then one person can raise their seawall, but to what elevation if they're flooding? And even if they do, what does it matter if the neighbors don't? And so we established a minimum seawall elevation across all of the coast, all of the county. And today, if there's a new seawall, it needs to be built to 5 feet NAVD. NAVD is a datum, but it's an important number to know because currently we have a lot of old infrastructure that sits at 1, and we flood at 1.3. So this is a sizable adjustment, but it's been in place since 2020, and when it was adopted, there were no challenges because everyone realized it was flooding, and they wanted to have a guarantee that if they invested their money in a seawall improvement, it was going to function, and you can't deliver that guarantee unless everyone's held to the same standard. I already mentioned our updating on the finished floor elevation, so I won't go into the details, except to acknowledge that it included supersaturation of the groundwater table, assuming no storage because it's been raining, 2 feet of sea level rise, and a 1 in 100-year storm event. And the line on the top blue line, is the new finished floor elevation that would have to be met if these structures were to be constructed today. So it affects residential and commercial infrastructure. Those other lines kind of show how the finished floor elevations have changed with time. But the important thing is there's 2 things. 1, ensuring that we're protecting against future flood damage and losses. And 2, we're planning for a future standard. FEMA does not. FEMA flood insurance maps only address risk today. And as conditions change, the FEMA flood map will change, and that elevation will get higher and higher. Well, for every foot that you are below the FEMA flood elevation, flood insurance doubles. So our goal is to always be ahead of that flood insurance map and make sure that we're planning for the future conditions. So as FEMA comes back in and model, we're not saddled with unaffordable insurance, and we want to, of course, continue to have flood insurance be available. So those 2 things. So that's what we worked on with regards to new infrastructure, but then the conversation becomes, well, what about the rest of the landscape? I mean, I live in a community where I don't anticipate redevelopment right away. I'm flooding, what about me? So we've been in the process of developing a countywide resilience plan that's focused on coordinated infrastructure and redevelopment strategies. We know it's smart because, well, for a number of reasons, but we also partnered, again, as a region, the 4 counties, with cost share participation from the business community, and we conducted an economic evaluation or return on investment that comes with planning for resilience, both in the way of landscape level improvements like seawalls and stormwater management systems, as well as site level improvements, which would be, our individual structures. And what this study demonstrated, when you look at property values, tax revenues, sales tax, insurance reductions, 2-to-1 return on investment for community-wide infrastructure, and a 4-to-1 return on investment when you're looking at property level adaptation. So we know it pays. So we're in the process of finalizing a 2-year plan now that has focused on a countywide risk assessment based upon all the combined flood factors that I've mentioned, economic modeling under the no action and action scenarios, and we're just finalizing the adaptation planning and working on rolling out this community-wide plan that we can all use. Here's the full combination of scenarios, so you can kind of plug and play, look at risk based on any combination of the events shown here. There's more than 50 that we've modeled. We have an online viewer where anyone can come into the system, select the scenarios that they like, and compare it across scenarios. What I'll share is that while we did not explicitly model a 1 in 1,000-year rainfall event, that's precisely what we saw in April last year when we received 26 inches of rainfall in 12 hours. And that event aligned with a 3-foot sea level rise scenario, storm surge under a 1 in 100-year storm, 100-year rainfall event, king tide, and groundwater table rise. We saw 5 feet of flooding at the airport, 2 to 3 feet of flooding within homes, and this was an afternoon storm system. So again, while we're not planning for a 1,000-year rainfall event, we know what it looks like. And so this plan will help us. We're not going to design our infrastructure for a 1 in 1,000-year storm. It's frankly not possible, but we'll at least understand how much we're able to address and how much risk we're leaving on the table, and what then needs to be part of your evacuation, as well as insured losses. So we're looking at finalizing all of the exposures and the ROI, the return on investment, based upon the hazards, the first-party losses, indirect, cascading impacts, key metrics in terms of asset values, insurance affordability, et cetera. We'll be releasing in full form the plan in about the July timeframe. Some of the early economic modeling, it's consistent with what we knew from the 4-county analysis, but you can see the concentration of damage losses in those graphics on the right relative to current sea level rise and 3.3 foot of sea level rise. We're looking at a 5-fold increase in annual average losses if we don't make these investments. We're estimating a 13% reduction in property values countywide. Has major implications for tax revenues, the ad valorem and what we can pay for. So the whole form of the plan ultimately looks at creating storage in the system, below ground and above ground, reducing impervious, improving conveyance in our canals and our drainage systems, and then the seawall barriers themselves. And in terms of performance, we are never going to live in an area where we don't have water. I mean, we receive 60 inches of rainfall anyway, but the intent is, again, to manage the frequency, duration, depth, spatial extent, et cetera. And you can see in the modeling, and this work is relatively new, with all of the measures employed, the reduction in depths and spatially in terms of the intensity of flooding, and pretty strong performance across the board. We'll be developing planning level cost estimates for that work, and I expect that we'd be moving forward with a countywide initiative to look at rolling that out as part of a multi-decade improvement plan, and much more that can't be covered. And finally, I just want to note that for a lot of our work, we really emphasize the IPCC report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in terms of the state of the science, what we know in terms of conditions and trends and forecasts. This is the most conservative, technical and policy-oriented body on the planet. There's hundreds of scientists, thousands of politicians. Every word is carefully scrutinized. But we've moved from a state of the science in the 80s where there could be some relationship between what's happening with emissions and global climate change, to an absolute certainty that we are driving what's happening, and we still have the ability to harness or bracket the severity of the conditions that we inherit. And we've already taken the most extreme of sea level rise scenarios off the table because of emissions reductions that have been achieved in the last 15 years. And we still stand to be able to make sizable reductions in dampening and impacts in our own lifetimes through accelerated emissions reductions. You saw the figures on heat. The graphic on the top right shows our record heat in Broward County in 2023 in the yellow column relative to everything measured historically in the green. You need an entirely different graph for that information. And here's our 26-inch rainfall event, Broward Boulevard in downtown Fort Lauderdale, right after rush hour. I was locked in that mess. We had 100 inches of rain in Broward County in the Fort Lauderdale area last year relative to our long-term average of 58. So I've kind of talked already about quantifying the benefits, so I'll just conclude in the note. I think we're all experiencing shared realization of the challenges to come with both heat and flooding. There's a lot to learn from the research, the tools, and the experiences of others. Loved the dune examples that were shared. But we need large-scale adaptation on the physical side and very aggressive emissions reductions in parallel to help bracket the extent of what we need to plan for in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Mike. 3 wonderful presentations. I have a couple questions I'm going to ask the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience if you have any, so be thinking about that. I'll start with Mike, and this is a kind of a question or also kind of a request for a comment. You know, when you're going through your projections and looking ahead to 2070 through the Acune model, and particularly when you brought it home for Park Shore and Gulf Shore Boulevard North, first of all, I saw a lot of people in the audience picking up their cell phones to call their insurance agent or their realtor out of concern about what was going to happen. But seriously, you look at those projections, and it paints a very serious, if not long-term, dire picture. And you know, this is Easter week, so we want to end with some good news. What I hear you saying is, whether we like it or not, this is the frame that we need to be looking at our future with as it relates to the likely occurrence of sea level rise and therefore flooding risk for our community. I'm focusing now on Naples and Collier County when I say this. Is that the right perspective for people to have as they look at this data that you shared and these projections? I'm just looking for you to comment a little further as to how people here in the audience and our residents should be thinking about this.
It's always on. Anyway, hi. Yeah, Ray, thanks for the question. You know, I think there's two ways to consider your own risk. I mean, one is you know, risking your own safety, the safety of your family, and knowing that you know, a storm surge on top of sea level rise may be pending, and to have enough foreknowledge to know that you're in a risky location and you need to get out of the way. And I suspect a lot of people didn't get out of the way in advance of Ian, and that caused great problems. The second thing is those maps of the nuisance flooding when sea level goes up an amount, and when we have these sunny day flooding events that might happen with a certain frequency during the year. Jennifer made some interesting points that you need to keep in mind. Those are depths of water on the surface, but your living surface may be higher than that. Your base flood elevation is hopefully above those elevations. And that's something that new home owners should consider. That's something that people that are considering redevelopment or increasing the resilience of your home or your condominium should be considerate of. And that is, where does your base flood elevation sit relative to where those potential nuisance flooding heights are likely to be? And those are relatively, at least, easy things to think about, whether they're easy things to address in terms of your financial investment in your home. You know, the storms themselves, I mean, you look at some of those projections. If you replay Ian in 2070, if you remember that map that showed the 1 in 100 year storm in 2070 with the NOAA intermediate high curve, you know, those kinds of storm surge depths are intractable and are not things that anybody can probably adapt to. But knowing that they're there can influence your own personal decisions about where you decide to live or how you invest in your home. And it also provides insights as to ways in which to handle your cautiousness. I guess I know too much about storms to never hang around to see what's going to happen. And I guess I value my own life and the life of my family over whatever might be in my home. So I'm not sure that answers your question. But I don't think those maps should be viewed with a dire, hopeless kind of mindset. Mm-hmm. I think it's just a matter of being aware of what those risks are and being prepared for those risks.
Well said. Thank you. Jennifer, it's always great to get perspectives from people from other places, and I really appreciate you coming over to share your experience with us. As I was listening to you talk, I had three major takeaways from what you said. And I want you to maybe comment on what I'm about to say. One is that there is really a regional approach that's being taken on the southeast coast of Florida with Broward, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Monroe County working together and sharing experiences and actions. Number two, that you're not really limiting yourself to standards and requirements that may have been in place today or in place in the past from the state of Florida or FEMA or anybody else. You're developing your own stricter, higher standards and requirements based on what you see as your real world experience over there. And number three, that there's no silver bullet here, there's no one solution. You're looking at a whole variety of actions, whether it's seawalls, tougher building codes, land use regulations, et cetera, et cetera. Do I have that right, and would you like to amplify on those points and anything else related to it as to how you're all going about it over on the East Coast? And I should say as a preface also, you've been at it longer. You've been at it longer, and because the reality of these climactic effects really manifested themselves much sooner on the East Coast of Florida than they did on the West Coast.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we actually started working on issues of sea level rise in the early 2000s, and that was focused on water supply because we were seeing that sea level rise was doubling the rate of saltwater intrusion into our coastal wells. And we started to see, more of the high tide flooding with predictability commencing in 2012. But we were all starting climate action planning around 2006 and had climate task forces in 2008. And that's true of many of our counties. But by working together, the benefit that we've had there really is, bringing a robustness to the planning tools. By the time we develop a regional sea level rise projection, it's well vetted, and it isn't, it's not like we pulled it out from underneath the desk or something. So we've been able to attract a lot in the way of resources and investments and partners because we're working regionally. And, I think some of those partners are better able to justify supporting us because of the regional benefits. It's not as if we're this tiny community and, we're going to consume all of their staff hours and to what avail. So the other really advantageous thing has been the power of utilizing our voices together. One example is that we've been desperately trying to bring accelerated planning by the Army Corps of Engineers to the Central Southern Flood Control Project. We knew in 2009 we needed investments there, and despite all of our efforts, we finally got an authorization, we finally got some funding, but it has taken regional championing to move the Corps and to involve our congressional members. Doing that alone, Broward County would not have had the same weight. And then finally, I'll say about the regional work is just a sharing of expertise. Some folks are transportation experts. I have more of a water background. Somebody else might have energy, somebody else building code. And you work together and you get to capitalize on the intelligence of everyone. I was reading something the other day. We all think we're smarter than we are, but actually humans are designed to, solve problems together. So that works. The building code issues, I know that regulations and authorities, they differ from one area to another. In Broward, we have county-wide land use authority, and we're able to use that to advance across the entire landscape a more strict standard, and we work really hard to defend that with good science. And when we've advanced these changes, there have not been objections. We've been able to do it with the support of the business community and the development community. We've been able to demonstrate that the incremental cost is minor relative to the exposures, and thankfully we have a community that understands those issues. And then, what was the last question? It was building code, it was stricter standards, regional
Oh,
collaboration.
just that you know, there's a wide array of arrows in your quiver that you're using to
Yeah.
try to address these problems.
Yes, thank you. So we've been vetting the adaptation performance on this modeling the last 2 weeks with our cities. And yeah, there is not a single strategy alone that is going to work, and not every strategy is the best one in every community. We've got some inland areas, some coastal areas, and we are going to have to pull from all of the options. But what we've been very careful to defend is just because one solution looks challenging today, it might be your preferred solution in 20 years. So don't erase it, because you certainly want to have the ability to pull from that whole toolbox rather than limit yourself to 2 or 3, which when we already know that those 2, 3 can't deliver at the level that we need across the landscape. And yeah, so just appreciating it's not, and the final thing, it's just like Everglades restoration. I don't think we'll ever be done. And we're not ever going to just say we're done with adaptation planning. It'll be a constant revisiting and honing and ramping up, but we're not going to be able to tell our leadership in 2035 that we've completed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And mentioning the Everglades is a reminder to all of us that one thing the East Coast and the West Coast of Florida have in common is the Everglades and how it impacts both of us. And I appreciate you mentioning the Corps of Engineers also, because we can learn a lot from the East Coast as we go through our own process here. That's a subject for a whole nother forum someday. Natalie, really appreciated your updated summary of what the city is going through. I'm personally very proud of what our city team has done and is doing to develop this resilience and adaptation plan. And as you heard from Natalie, we'll be getting a presentation at City Council on May 15th. So it's almost complete, at least in its draft form. So that's exciting. We don't have the same spirit and ethos here on the West Coast with respect to regionalism that they seem to have on the East Coast, and the ability to work collaboratively with the counties, particularly Collier and Lee, and some of the larger municipalities has not been present. And I don't want to put you in a delicate spot to make a political comment, but you know, what has been your experience with trying at the staff level to work with, let's just say, Collier County, to try to have some common ground in terms of how we approach these problems?
Well, I think working working regionally is definitely challenging, since City of Naples is kind of heading, we're far ahead of some of our county counterparts. But that being said, a lot of dialogue has been opened up from the Army Corps project that's going on with Collier County, and looking at regional participation. Like, there's a lot more conferences and stuff for us to attend. But Collier County has started their vulnerability assessment, and I look forward to working with them as they develop through their vulnerability assessment and get to their adaptation plan, that we can work more regionally to accomplish goals. Collier County has been, just instrumental in our beach and dune renourishment efforts after the hurricane. So they're great partners. We work together, quite closely with each other, and, having them kind of get to the same page where they're, we're all working on our adaptation planning and trying to develop projects regionally versus just the city is going to be, a really great, thing to look forward to. But they're here, they're at the table, we're all, talking to each other, and we're just all trying, we're starting at different steps, and we're trying to all get on the same stage, so to speak.
I appreciate that, and it's really what I hope you would bring out. I think while at the political level, there may not be always a meeting of the minds. When I say the political level, the elected official level, including myself, meeting of the minds among all the parties. I think at the staff level, there increasingly is a collaborative working relationship and a recognition as to what we need to get done, and I think that is progress, and I'm glad it's occurring. Are there questions from the audience? We started a little late, so it is 10:30, but we can go a few minutes more if it's okay with you. If there's some questions, and I see one over here. Here comes a microphone for you.
Okay. Feel important now. I was very interested to hear from the Broward County side that there was an issue of groundwater rising, and I was wondering if that was an issue in our region, if that's something that we all have to worry about here, because I hadn't heard that before. I try to keep on top of it. And then my other question real quick is the berm planting, the dune planting that's going to be happening soon in Naples and Collier County. I was wondering what the time frame for that was.
On the first question, Natalie, can you respond to that?
Yeah, actually, groundwater has not been at the forefront of our adaptation planning, and partially because at least I don't have good data on the groundwater in this area. I have attended some South Florida Water Management District meetings recently where some of that is coming up, and work on integrating that as we get some more information.
And on
I just want to note that for our efforts, the USGS has been our long-standing partner. We have like a 50-year agreement where we've collectively invested in the build-out and maintenance of a very substantial groundwater monitoring network. And that data is available online. You might find that there's some data available for the Naples area as well.
If I could just throw my 2 cents in. I think the groundwater issue probably requires greater attention here than it's gotten. It hasn't imposed itself. Its impacts haven't imposed itself yet. But I personally worry that those impacts will eventually creep up and influence us. So I think it's worth investing. The Water Management District, the survey. We have a hydrology group at the water school, and to focus some more attention on what's happening here would be a valuable thing.
And on your second question, maybe I can best respond to that. The berm planting or replanting effort will occur as currently scheduled in July, August of this year, and there's been a major effort. This is led by the county, and they've been engaged in a major planning effort really for quite some time with city involvement and community homeowner association involvement. There are people in the room today I know who have been very much involved in that. And so the plan is long since approved. The plants had to be acquired and nurtured, and the timetable now, as I understand it, would be around July, August for the actual plantings to occur. Yeah.
One other thing about the planting, this is something I'm very excited about. I know Natalie's excited about this too. There has been a real sort of region-wide coming together to determine how to most effectively restore the right ecology on the dunes so that they're most effective at not only protecting the dune, but allowing the dunes to build naturally. Dunes naturally accrete if the right plants are there. We have worked, I say we, the Naples Botanical Garden, FGCU, has worked closely with, running from south to north, Marco Island, Naples, Collier County, Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel, where we're talking about a more effective restoration design for the ecology. So the good news is I believe that when those dunes are planted, they're going to be done with best science in mind. One of the problems, however, is having enough material to plant those dunes. So the number of plants that are raised horticulturally in greenhouses is somewhat limited. So the region needs a lot of plants. I think Collier is or 2.5 million plants for Naples alone, or is that all of Collier? For Collier alone. And of course, the damage and the extent of the in-place berms in Lee County are much larger and would require even more plants.
Yeah, good comments, Mike, and it is the way that project has come together is a model for us, perhaps for doing other sorts of things. Other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question. I've got a follow-up, actually. Natalie, I made the comment during your meeting, and I apologize for interrupting, but we had less than 30% of the normal level of rainfall in Naples last summer. You dismissed that as being La Nina. Yet the East Coast, as Jennifer had mentioned, had an abundance of rainfall. Now, I've been a resident and owned a home in Park Shore for over 30 years. Our skies were different last summer, okay? And the noticeable difference is being perpetrated as a result of what's called stratospheric aerosolized injections. This is geoengineering that our government and NOAA and other organizations are engaged in. When you look at the skies and see 30, 40-mile-long plumes of chemicals coming out off of jets at 35, 40,000 feet, those are not condensation trails. Those are SAI, stratospheric aerosolized injections. Okay, now, if you are interested in what I'm saying, and if you've noticed the difference in looking at our skies, go to a site called geoengineeringwatch.org and watch the documentary called The Dimming. Now, Mike, I've reached out to you as a scientist who receives his funding and income in large part from government grants, NOAA, and so forth. You're selling their narratives, okay? I have asked you to look at the chemical composition of our rainfall. I've suggested you study soil samples, specifically right after Ian, and take that into consideration. Because what's happening is we are being subjected to weather modification strategies being perpetrated by our government to further the climate change narratives that you're being presented with today. And, you know, Mike, as a scientist, the scientific method requires that when you are introduced to new information that goes away from your thesis, that you take those items into consideration and take a look at them. You know, we all see our skies have changed. If you take a look at these chemical trails that are being dumped on us constantly, there's a reason for it, and it needs to be considered. And that's what I.
You made your point. Thank you. Yes, sir.
My question is for Jennifer, especially for the IPCC. Are you aware of any particular project that is technology innovation involved in terms of new materials and new architectural designs, especially for the improvement of the seawalls and the management of the flow of water in and out?
I'm not sure about the improvement to the seawalls. I mean, clearly there's, just in terms of material construction, I mean, you could talk about carbon sequestration, which hardens some of those materials, generating seawalls with bioforms that enhances or reduces, you know, wave energy and provides for additional recruitment of, you know, fauna so that you have more of a living seawall. You've got the issues with seawalls are in part how deep is the seawall constructed, and might it be deep enough in order to prevent seepage from below, at least in our case where we have you know, rising groundwater table. You also have the issue of when you construct a higher seawall, is it potentially impounding water that could overtop the seawall and ultimately needs to drain? A lot of the coastal properties have frankly relied upon that runoff and discharge and don't have the same water management systems that a more inland property would have. There are one-way valves that have been utilized in the seawalls to allow for that drainage, but those one-way valves are not intended to be used at depth, but more at the shallower surface. And I know that there's more in the way of like 3D printing for like uniform construction of the seawalls. There's interior materials other than rebar that are being employed. You know, there's new, I mean, in terms of overall technologies, alternatives to concrete, yes, looking at being able to produce these same things, not utilizing limestone, but utilizing another base rock. So I'm not sure, I mean, in terms of other technologies, there's plenty with regards to solar and energy production, so I'm not quite sure where to go, but with regards to seawalls, that's what I'm familiar with. I don't know if it's responsive to your question.
Okay.
No, it's not.
Thank you.
I apologize.
Why don't we take, is there another question here, Stan? Yeah,
Yeah.
this will be the last question, and let me just say, I think our panelists can remain for a little while anyway, once we adjourn here in a moment, and would be happy to talk one-on-one to those of you who might have additional questions. But please, this will be the last question.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments and the questions before me, because it seems like we concentrate only on the water system. And why does Broward County has such a high water level, underground water level, and where does it come from? I mean, we changed the Everglades, and we thought that was a great idea. Now you're going to have other proposals to change again. Is that going to be the great idea for the future? Do we look at a big picture and include, for example, the size of the humongous buildings we build on a single family lot? What landscaping we have there? We changed a lot, the landscaping. Does that influence the groundwater? Does that influence the weather? I mean, it's great that we continue the dune rebuilding and landscaping, but what do we do with the rest of the county? I mean, when I look from the picture, Naples looks like a green city, and I'm very proud of it. But when I walk through my neighborhood, Park Shore, I see humongous building taking nearly the entire lot. So that is my concern. Does that has an influence too?
Well, perhaps I can briefly respond. If any of the panelists wish to, they can as well. But you raised a number of interrelated issues. But I think one piece of good news is that the city of Naples has focused in recent years in improving our regulations as it relates to stormwater management in our built environment. We passed an ordinance a couple of years ago that doubled the amount of water that needed to be stored on site with new construction, which will make a major difference. The issue of pervious versus impervious surface in home construction remains an issue that is constantly being discussed. There have been suggestions that we want to change our land use ordinances as it relates to residential construction to require more pervious surface on the building lot, or change the definition as to what is considered pervious versus impervious. I'm talking about lanais and pool decks and so on. That becomes very controversial, because when you talk about reducing the amount of lot coverage that can be built upon, people are concerned about that diminishing property values. And so you have lots of people on both sides of that issue, but it's something that's constantly being discussed, and I'm sure will continue to be in the future as we look for ways to manage stormwater and reduce flooding. So thank you for the question. With that, I'm going to adjourn the formal part of the program. I want to again thank GSAC for sponsoring this forum, and thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our panelists, Mike and Natalie and Jennifer, for their superb presentations, and the thought-provoking comments that they made. I think we all learned something here today, and this is a conversation that will be continued in many ways. So let's give our panel one final big hand. Thank you for coming.